Thank you, everyone, and I'm very thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today about passwords, something that we're all very familiar with. We spend lots of time inputting passwords every day in order to access our most sensitive information. They are essentially what we use in order to prove that we are who we say that we are to a computer system. But we have so many of them that we tend to forget them, and we spend a lot of extra time trying to reset them. This is a major issue, especially because we often wonder whether or not these passwords are serving their main purpose. Are they really protecting our information the way that they're supposed to be? So we don't tend to have a lot of positive feelings about passwords in general. It is one thing that we found was really interesting, though, is that despite those feelings that we have about passwords, we do tend to inject more positive thoughts into the passwords that we create. And let me just start the presentation by telling you about some of the research that we did on real passwords that people have chosen and what kind of information that they put in those passwords and what kind of topics they put in there. So we actually analyzed a large data set of 32 million passwords as one of our research projects. And we found that the most common the most common word that exists in passwords that people create is love. And this is demonstrated by this Wordle that I have here on the slide, which shows the popularity, it visualizes the popularity of all of these words that we found that exist in people's passwords. So the larger words are the more popular ones, and love really pops out of there. So another few interesting facts that are kind of fun is that male names are 4 times more likely to follow the term I love than female names. And finally, one thing that's very nice is that love is 23 times more common to appear in passwords than hate is. So while patterns like these are very heartwarming and very interesting, the not so lovely truth about them is that they do form a threat to password security. And that's something that I'm hoping to be able to convey to you today, is what that threat really is. So the outline of my talk today is going to be discussing some of the threats to passwords that exist today, what you can do right now to protect yourself. So I'll go over 4 different recommendations for how you can protect yourself. And then I'll talk about our research at UOIT on passwords and new password systems. So before I delve into the threats that I'm going to discuss today, I'd like to highlight something that might be a little bit different about security research than a lot of the other research fields you've looked at within these series. Something that you would expect that we do is developing new security protections. That's not surprising. But something that we do that's a little bit unusual is that we do also try to break them. So we try to act like hackers in order to get a better sense of what the actual security is that's offered by a system. And we feel that that's really the only way we can do this, because if we just put our heads in the sand and we try to pretend that attackers don't have better techniques, more motivation, more resources, then we might mistakenly believe that systems are more secure than what they actually are. So that's the reason that we do this kind of research as well, is to try to gain a better, more realistic sense of what the real and true security is that's offered by a system. So the last part of this cycle of security research is that given the new threats that we find, we want to create stronger defenses. So it really creates a cycle of building stronger defenses by trying to attack them and improve them later on. So next I'm going to talk about threats, but in order to understand some of the threats that I'm going to talk about to passwords, we need to get a better understanding of how passwords are actually stored on computer systems. So I'm going to explain this to you through an example. And the way that passwords are stored on computer systems is not as you would initially expect. So if you imagine that you have a user named Alice and her password is Toronto 2016, you might imagine that Toronto 2016 is what's stored on the computer system, but it's not actually that. The way that the computer system stores them is through hash form. So what I mean by that is that there's a function, in this example slide we call it H, that Toronto 2016 is put through. And that function transforms that password into something that is scrambled. So it looks something like what we have highlighted in blue in this slide. Just a scrambled looking string that you can't get any information from. So the idea is that that string will not reveal any information about the original password. So you can't take that random scrambled looking string and get Toronto 2016 back from it. So what happens then on the system is that it's stored in something called a password file or a password table that contains all of the accounts for the users on the system. So here we have Alice and Bob, and it contains their hash passwords. So then what happens later on is Alice goes to log into her account that she already created. She sends her username, Alice, and her password, Toronto 2016. And what the system then does is they hash Toronto 2016 again, like they did in the beginning. And then they use that output string, that blue string there, and compare it against all of the accounts that are listed in that table. And once they find that it matches Alice's account, they recognize that, yes, it was the correct password, Toronto 2016, that she input. That's the way that they consider it as proof that she entered Toronto 2016. So the reason that this matters is, and the reason that computer systems do this, is because if this password file is ever leaked to an attacker or somebody who wants to harm that user or that system, that it's not revealing what their password is. So if they have this file, they don't know that Alice's password is Toronto 2016. They just see this scrambled-looking string. So what happens if they do get this password file and they try to log in with that random-looking string, what happens is that the system will hash that random-looking string the same way that they would hash Toronto 2016, and they get another random-looking string that doesn't match her hashed password. So then access is not allowed as a result. So because of this system, because of this way of storing passwords, we're hoping that we're at least providing a little bit more protection to people's passwords in the event that an attacker can get access to this file. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to tell you about what the first threat is that I would like to discuss today. And the reason that I'd like to talk about this is that it might not be obvious in the beginning that there is a threat of attackers being able to get those password files that I mentioned in the last slide. And the unfortunate reality of today's world is that we are seeing that a lot of password leaks are happening. So you may have been following the news lately, and you may have noticed that there are a lot of news announcements about big companies that we're all familiar with, like Dropbox, Yahoo. Another one is MySpace and LinkedIn. They've had what we call a password leak, where this password file has been revealed to an attacker. Somehow they managed to get access to that system and take the password information and reveal it publicly online. So this is a bit of a problem. It is starting to happen more frequently. Some websites are estimating that about 2 billion accounts have been leaked in recent years, and over 150 different websites. So here's just a snapshot of some of the different websites that have had account breaches, where these password files have been leaked publicly. So you might be wondering at this point in time, why does this matter? Okay, so we've established that these password files can be leaked, but why does it matter? Because you've just finished telling me that the passwords are stored in a hash form, and that means they're safe. But it's not, unfortunately, necessarily always the case. There are a few tricks that attackers can do in order to guess passwords even after they've been hashed. And even aside from that, some of these password leaks, unfortunately, have passwords that haven't been hashed. So in that case, they are immediately obvious to the attacker what the original user's passwords were. So when they're stored in the clear, that means that in our example of Alice, Toronto 2016 was what was leaked for Alice, which is a problem. But in the case where they're hashed, they just get these random-looking strings. But like I said before, there are ways for them to be able to guess them. So I'm going to briefly describe how an attacker can cleverly guess what a hash password is. So in this case, we imagine that this is all happening on the attacker's computer. The website is not involved at all anymore because their password information has been stolen. And this is the password information that we imagine being on the attacker's computer. So what happens now is the attacker builds something that we call a word list. And that word list contains an ordering of passwords that they think are the most probable to the least probable. So it would start with passwords, for example, that they know are common, like password 1, password 123, and then eventually, maybe towards the middle of the list, they would have the password Toronto 2016. And what they do is they take every entry in that word list and they run it one by one through that hash function that I mentioned earlier on. So then they end up with a big, long, scrambled-looking string that they then compare to the entry that they're trying to guess in the password file. They check, does that match Alice's hash password? If it does, then we know we have Alice's password. If it doesn't, then they move along to the next passwords in that password list. And then eventually they get to Toronto 2016, hash it, and then they get that big, long, random string that actually does turn out to match Alice's hash password. Once they have that match, then they know that the original password was the one that they put through that hash function, the entry that they were last on in that word list. So this is how password guessing happens. And the really key part of that is something called the word list that I mentioned before. The attacker's goal is to build this so that it's very efficient, so that it goes from the most probable passwords to the least probable. So we have things like password 123 at the beginning, then some other kind of random looking ones in the middle, and then at the very end you would have the most random looking passwords. The ones that they would think are the least probable for an attacker, for a user to actually get, to use as their password. So the way that they do this is by studying passwords and passwords. So they actually look at what kind of passwords people are choosing and try to estimate what are the most probable passwords and what are the least probable. So that brings us to the first project that we did here at UOIT that I think is of interest to this particular field. And that was password semantics and their security impact. And this was work that was done in collaboration with Rafael Veras and Christopher Collins at UOIT. So the questions that we asked are, number one, what are the semantic patterns in passwords? So really, what are the meanings in passwords? We know that people aren't really random. We know that people aren't choosing passwords based on characters necessarily. So what are the real meanings and relationships between meanings that people are choosing in their passwords? So for example, the fun facts that I brought out at the beginning of the lecture, those are all things that came out of our analyses of the semantics in passwords. So for example, the fact that male names are 4 times more likely to follow I love than female names. So those are really interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. But the thing that was particularly relevant to this piece of research is how do those semantics affect password security in the end? So by understanding how much they affect password security, it will help us understand what are attacker capabilities when it comes to password guessing, and then how can we improve passwords later on as a result of those improved capabilities. So just as a side note, I'd like to, because it's interesting, these are the things that we found to be common categories that people were choosing in passwords. So the top 10 were male name, female name, city, surname, the verb to be, verb love, noun form of verb, baby, month, and girl. So those general categories are what people tend to put in their passwords the most. So it's not the password itself, it's part of the password. Other things that we kind of grouped together, because they were themes that showed up time and time again, were sexual terms, royalty, animals, dirty words, and food. So they're of interest, and they certainly are the fact that they exist and they happen time and time again points towards tendencies that people have in the passwords that they choose. And those patterns, again, are the kind of things that attackers can use to figure out what are the most probable passwords and what are the least probable passwords in order to order that word list that I mentioned before. So in general, what we did, and this is a very high-level abstraction of what we did, but we took 32 million leaked passwords, and we used those, and we used natural language processing techniques on those 32 million passwords and put them into machine learning in order to figure out a generalization of what kind of passwords people are choosing. And then we use that in order to generate new passwords that we think that were probable that people would choose. So I'm going to show this by a very simple example where we only have 2 input passwords instead of 32 million. But the general idea is that if the 2 passwords that were put as input to the system had a very similar structure, it would learn that structure and then abstract it as it could. Here we have I love chimps and I love humans as our 2 passwords that were input into the system. And the way that the semantic password software that we created that did the natural language processing and the machine learning, what it would do with that is it would say, I love primate is the generalization of these two passwords, because that's a pattern that exists between them. So then it would take that generalization and use it to create new passwords that weren't seen in the original leaked password data set. Now, it would be able to recreate the ones that were put as input, the I love chimps and I love humans, but the ones that it could create that are new are I love monkeys and I love gorillas. So things that were similar in nature, that were very sensible, but they weren't actually in the original data set. So this is the technique that we used. And the result was that it did produce the best known offline attacks to passwords. So we ran some tests on other password leaks that were at the time revealed. So the MySpace and LinkedIn leaks were the ones that we chose. And we found that our technique guessed 32 to 67% more passwords in the same number of guesses as previous techniques. So this result was actually confirmed by other researchers, so it wasn't just our result. And the takeaway that I really want you to get is that guessing attacks are a real threat, especially in light of these data breaches that we're seeing. So we have to assume that attackers are able to get these password files, and if they can, then what is the true result here? So we have a new set of threats anyway relating to password security. So the second threat that I'd like to talk about is something that we call password reuse. So the basic idea here is that people are choosing one password on one account, and then they're using that password across many other accounts that they have. And this is very commonplace. Almost everybody does it. In our own surveys that we did and other studies, we found that about 87% of people will at least report that they use the same password across multiple websites. So this is a very common thing that people do. And the reason it's a problem is if you think back to the password data leaks that I mentioned earlier, once one password is compromised, then that same password is compromised across multiple sites. If an attacker has your password for Dropbox, and if you use that same password on your Gmail and your OneDrive account, then they could actually log into those accounts as well. So that's a bit of a problem. Now, one thing that I would like to mention is that some people will recommend that it's okay if you reuse them across what we consider only low-value accounts. So I say this with extreme caution, that it is okay to use it for only low-value accounts, but you have to be sure that they're low-value accounts, because it's very difficult sometimes to identify what is a low-value account and what is not. So an example of a low-value account might be something like a news website, where you know that they're not collecting any information about you at all. But where things get tricky is I've heard a lot of people say that they consider their email account to be a low-value account. And the reason that they say that is quite logical. They say, well, I don't care if somebody wants to read my email. I don't have anything interesting in there. What does it matter? And you know, that might be a valid argument, but the issue is that a lot of people don't see is that you sign up for a lot of other accounts, like e-commerce accounts, using your email address. And whenever you forget the password in that account, which a lot of people do, you say, I forgot my password, send me a password reset link. And it emails that password reset link back to your email account. In that case, if your email account is compromised, then the attacker can reset your password for multiple accounts and then gain access to them as well. So it can be really tricky to identify accurately what is truly a low-value account and what is not. So that's why I say, if you do reuse passwords, exercise extreme caution, and you make sure that you're sure that they are low-value accounts. Threat number 3 that I'd like to mention is observation attacks. Now, this is something that has existed for a long time. You know, this is when we've often considered observation attacks shoulder surfing attacks, where somebody is looking over your shoulder as you're typing in your password or typing it in with your mobile device. And you know, that's something that's been around for a long time, but the reason that I'm mentioning it now is because it's something that is becoming more commonplace. There's more opportunities for people to observe your password because we're using mobile devices everywhere. And we're inputting our passwords in front of a lot of other people frequently. And not just in front of other people, we're also inputting our passwords in front of cameras. There's cameras everywhere, in buildings, in elevators, other people's cell phones that you might not realize are pointed in your direction. There's a lot of opportunities for observation that isn't just traditional looking over your shoulder. So it's just important to be aware that this is an issue and you want to make sure that people aren't looking at your passwords. So at this point, you're probably wondering, this doesn't sound very good, the whole status quo of passwords. So why are we using them still everywhere? I've heard of things like biometrics. I've heard of physical tokens. Why aren't we using them? And the real answer is cost. At the end of the day, we're continuing to use passwords because they're cheap. There's no extra equipment involved. There's no extra training costs for training people to use these new systems. Whereas with things like biometrics and physical tokens, you have enrollment costs. You need to have people come in and enroll them. You need to give them new equipment. And in the case of physical tokens, you need to be able to replace them in the event they get stolen or lost. So passwords are cheap. That's why they still continue to exist. A few other issues that exist with biometrics are failure to enroll, which is that there's some percentage of people who can never enroll in certain biometric technologies, and also failure to log in. So there's some percentage of people who, some percentage of the time, won't be able to log in. So you might have experienced that with fingerprint scanners that are pretty commonplace now on smartphones. Some percentage of the time, it just doesn't work. I know with myself anyway, there's some percentage of the time, it's actually pretty frequent that it doesn't work for me. Yeah, it can be that. It can also be that your fingerprint is dried and cracked. So, yeah, it's probably the case in mine. But it does happen. And it happens not just in fingerprints and in a lot of other things as well. So whenever we have a biometric, we typically also need to have a password as well in order just to back off. And in the case that it doesn't work, that we have something else that we can log in with. So you're probably saying at this point, great, how do I protect myself now? What do I do? And I'm going to give you 4 different recommendations that you can consider using in order to improve your security. The first one is find a password management strategy. Find something that you're comfortable with. And there's a few different things that I can recommend that are secure and good password management strategies that you can use some kind of combination of. The first one is to use a password manager. And a password manager, let me explain briefly what it is. It's essentially a list of passwords that you store on your system, but it's not the same thing at all, like creating a text document and typing in your passwords and just leaving it like that. It's not like a spreadsheet where you just type your passwords. If you're doing that right now, please don't do that. It's actually a very bad thing to do. Please start using something like a password manager. Because what a password manager does is it doesn't just leave it as a list of passwords on your system. It encrypts them. So it looks something more like this. A whole bunch of random numbers that you can't make any sense out of unless you have the key. And the key in this case is something called a master password. And that is just a single password. It's the only password that you would need to remember. And you just type in your username and your password, and it unlocks what we call the password vault. That's the encrypted list of passwords. And then you can use your passwords for all of your other accounts. Now, one challenge with using this is that we tend not to only use one device, right? Most of us have a home computer, a workplace computer, and maybe a mobile device as well, or some subset of those. So we need to be able to copy that same password vault across all of these different devices in order to be able to use it. So what a lot of password managers do is they store it in the cloud. They copy that password vault into the cloud. And what that means, you might have heard the term the cloud before. What that means is just another system on the internet. So it's just copied into another server on the internet that you have access to through another password, which is typically your master password. So you may or may not feel comfortable with that. Some people think that it's not a very good idea to have this information in the cloud because it presents a very attractive target for attackers. If they can crack the master password, then they have access to all of your accounts, not just one. So what some people are more comfortable with doing is using a version of a password manager that you have to copy manually. And you use that using something like a USB token. So that's another option. If you're not comfortable with that even, another thing that you can do is just resort to writing them down. But I say exercise extreme caution in this. This is very important. If you do this, you have to store those written passwords in a secure location, a physically secure location, meaning a location that nobody else has access to. So an example of a place like that would be safe is a locked safe in your home or office. So a locked cabinet even would be better. So some people are just more comfortable with this solution, and that's fine, because it is something that, it does have a little bit less convenience over a password manager, because with a password manager, You can obtain that copy from the cloud and copy it to another device. If you have it stored in a physically secure location, then you have to be in that physically secure location in order to be able to log in. So it depends on your comfort level. It depends on where you log in from. Some combination of these techniques is probably okay. Maybe there's some small set of passwords that you input very frequently and you know you can remember them. You can try remembering those, and then for the ones that you don't input very frequently, maybe you can put them in a password manager or write them down or do some combination of those things. But those are the subset of things that you should be doing in order to manage your passwords. So the second protection I'd like to mention is that you should verify that your accounts have not been leaked publicly. So what I mean by this is the password leaks that I was mentioning before. Your account could exist in one of them. Very easily. 2 billion accounts have been leaked at least. There is a website that you can go to in order to check this, and it's called https haveibeenpwned.com. And this is actually a legitimate website. It's run by a Microsoft employee. And what this person does is they aggregate all of the information that's out there for password leaks, and they make it so that you can search it to find out if your account has been leaked. So you can just do a quick search using their search box for the account names that you would have used. Typically, they're your email address, maybe a few different email addresses. And if you do find that any of the accounts have been compromised, make sure you reset the password. And reset, if you've reused that password, reset it on all of the accounts that you've used it on. Because it means that it's public knowledge now, potentially public knowledge if it was in a hash form. Another one that you can use, it's something that will just enhance your security a little bit more. It's not necessarily something you have to do, but it's something that you can do to improve it, is two-factor authentication. So this is something that's being adopted by a lot of websites now, where you don't have to use it, but you have the option of using it. You have two factors, the what you know, which is your password, and the what you have, which is your smartphone or your cell phone. So what it does is they will allow you to register your phone number. And once you've registered your phone number and you go to log in, it will send you an SMS code to your phone. And then you input the SMS code to prove that you have the phone. And then you input your password to prove that you know your password. So there's two different things that you're using in order to prove that you are who you claim to be. And that's just a good practice in general. It will protect against all of the attacks that I mentioned before. The last protection is that when you do have to choose a password, choose something that's strong. So the current recommendations are that you choose a password with 12 or more characters, that is pretty long. It has uppercase and lowercase characters, numbers and special characters, and not just at the end of the password. Unusual sequences of words, so something that doesn't really stand out as being a common word. And that it has uncommon themes. So it doesn't have any of those common themes that I mentioned earlier. And the common themes, again, were love, sexual terms, profanity, royalty, animals, food, money, names, dates, and places. So this does seem like a lot of things to comply with, a lot of recommendations to comply with. So I'd like to just share with you a strategy that can be helpful in trying to create a strong password. And that strategy is just to choose a phrase that you can remember but that cannot be found online. Because if it can be found online, then that means attackers can find it online and they can use that as a guess in their word list. Choose something that's a little bit personalized. Maybe it's based somehow on things that you're familiar with, but it's personalized in a way. So you could say something like a coffee a day, dash, dash, keeps the 5 little monkeys at bay. And then base your password on that phrase. So an algorithm that can work for that is that you select the first letter of every word in that phrase, and then you maintain the punctuation and numbers. So if we do that to the example phrase that I have up here, we would end up with capital A, CAD, dash, dash, KT, 5, capital L, capital M, maintaining the punctuation up here, AB. So it looks like a pretty random string. It doesn't contain usual sequences of words, doesn't contain common themes, and it has everything else that we want. So another thing that I can recommend to help you try to remember this phrase is to think about some kind of story to weave that phrase together. So maybe a picture could help you remember that. So an example could be, in this particular case of a coffee a day keeps the 5 little monkeys at bay, maybe you have a coffee mug that you drink your coffee out of every morning, and it has a monkey on it. So if you remember that picture, it'll help you remember that phrase and therefore your password. So our current research efforts are to try to come up with better ways for people to create stronger and yet memorable passwords. So this is really our focus area, to try to improve it so that things become a little bit easier in that recommendation on how to choose a strong password. So I'll talk about 3 different projects. The first one is GeoPass, and that's where we are talking about using memorable locations as a password instead of just typing it in. Another one is something that we call presentation effects, where we're trying to nudge people to choose a stronger password. And then the last one is using the password semantics research that I talked about before in order to help people generate more secure and yet memorable password suggestions. So we actually suggest something to people and see if they're okay with remembering that. So the first one that I'll talk about is GeoPass, and this was work done in collaboration with Brent McRae at UOIT and Amirali Salihi-Abari at University of Toronto. So what motivated this research is that a popular semantic category in passwords that we found is locations. So city names and country names really popped up over and over again. So it seemed like there was a bit of a tendency for people to choose them. So why not make use of that and make it more secure for people to choose that? Because if they were just typing in the names, there's not that many possible city names and country names in the world to make it secure enough. So let's try to make it secure, allow people to choose places. So what we did is we designed a system where people chose a password on a digital map. So they're shown an interface that looks like this, and then they have to select a location using what I'm going to show you right now. So this is a demo of what somebody would do in order to create this password. So right now, the person is thinking of Mont-Royal Park. They're typing in Mont-Royal Park up at the search bar at the top here. And then they select from a drop-down list Mont-Royal Park. It automatically zooms them in right there. They find something of interest, and then they right-click on it in order to select the exact location that they want to choose. And that location, it places an X mark on it. That location becomes their password, which effectively is a longitude-latitude coordinate. So instead of thinking of a sequence of characters, you're now thinking of a place and actually selecting the place on a map as your password. So we call that a location password. And it was something that wasn't particularly straightforward to design. It might look like it from the demo, but there were a few usability security trade-offs that we needed to consider when designing it. So the first one is, how far do people have to zoom in? Because we have this map of the world in the beginning. How far do they zoom in? Because the more that they zoom in, the more possible locations that there are that they could select, and therefore the more secure the system would be. But if we require people to zoom in too far, then it becomes not usable. So there was a trade-off here. We actually also found that if people zoomed in too far, that the map would lack enough detail in certain locations. So if you had a city that people were choosing a location in, there was lots of detail when people zoomed in far. But if you're in the country, there's not that much detail and people would get lost. So we found that the area where it was kind of a sweet spot was where streets and buildings are visible. So that was zoom level 16 according to the Google Maps API. So that was what we chose as how far people had to zoom in. Also, when it comes to choosing that location, people aren't going to be able to select the exact location again later on, because there's always a little bit of error tolerance that people need to be able to have. So deciding on that, if we went too narrow, it wouldn't be usable. But if we went too large, then we've lost a lot of the security that the system could offer, because then we've reduced the number of possibilities in the overall possible number of locations that exist in the world. So what we did is we chose about a 10 by 10 pixel area as the amount of error tolerance, and we selected that at zoom level 16 because what we found is a lot of people didn't remember how far they zoomed in. They might zoom in a little bit further when they choose their password, and then when they go to log in a little bit later on, they didn't remember that they zoomed in that far. So they would try setting their password again at zoom level 16. So these were things that we all found through iterative design and pilot testing of the system. And the final thing was the initial map view. We could theoretically make it easier on people. They wouldn't have to zoom in as far if, say, for example, in Canada, we showed people the map of Canada, and they just had to choose a location in Canada. But that would remove a lot of the possible locations they could choose, and that would reduce security. So we were concerned about this, and we did a little bit of testing just to see what do people do with the system. And we decided on the entire world, just because we found that most people who use the system, they use that search bar that I showed in the demo. And when they use the search bar, it doesn't really matter if it's the initial map of the world or if it's the initial map of Canada. It will zoom them into approximately where they want to get anyway. So we ran a user study in order to figure out, is this actually secure and usable? And we ran a test with 35 users where they logged into the system 3 times over 1 week, the day that they created it, 1 day later, and 1 week after the second day test. And we found that the system actually had really strong memorability. We found that 97% of people remembered it immediately, 100% 1 day later, and 97% 1 week later. So that's pretty promising. We also found that it did take a little bit longer than traditional passwords to log in. The median login time was about 25 to 30 seconds, so that does limit the context of use. It's not something that we can use to replace all passwords, but maybe in some contexts where people only log in once a week, for example. So we also wanted to analyze the system. So I mentioned before how we try to break systems that we've created in order to try to figure out how much security it truly offers. We wanted to know, by moving people into the space of a map, are we just creating a whole new set of patterns? Or are we actually resulting with a system that is secure? So we consider different types of attackers in order to estimate the security of the system, where they have different amounts of information about the target user. So the first one that we consider is what we call the unknown adversary, where the attacker will not know any information about the user. So that forces them to guess all of the landmass in the world. Then we also consider an attacker who knows something about the user. So maybe they've done some social engineering research. Maybe they've scoured their social networking profiles. Maybe they know them personally and know where they've traveled to. And in that case, they would only guess the places where they know that the person has been to. And then the last one that we consider is that we assume that the people are going to choose locations near where the system itself exists. So in the case of, let's say that U of T were to adopt GeoPass for logging in, then the attacker would assume that all of the people who are using the system live somewhere near U of T, maybe in Toronto, maybe in the GTA. So what they would do is guess all of the landmass in the GTA. And then we do further estimates based on considering all landmass within those regions. And we consider those to be high estimates because we know realistically not everybody is going to choose all of the landmass. They're not all possible locations. So we also do a low estimate that is based on points of interest according to tripadvisor.com. So that would identify things like shopping malls, restaurants, hotels, etc., parks. So what we found was that GeoPass did have stronger security than passwords, according to some ways of looking at it, but not as much as we would like to see. Like, it's not actually going to protect against all of the attacks, all of the types of guessing attacks that we mentioned earlier. So we looked to see whether or not we could secure location passwords even further by adding something that we call a note, or an easily associable set of text. So like a word or a sequence of words that the person could associate with a location that wasn't exactly labeling it. Like if they were to choose a shopping mall, for example, not that they would choose the name of the shopping mall, but maybe talk about some experience or a person that they went shopping with. So the addition of that note is very simple, right? But it's very purposeful. It's something that will increase the attack resistance to guessing attacks and also to observation attacks. So there is a lot of point to doing this. So we did a study just to see, will people choose annotations or notes that are very similar to the place that they chose? And if they do that, what is the security impact? And also, do people have difficulty now guessing, remembering their locations? Because by adding more information, maybe we're impacting memorability in a way that's negative. So we wanted to determine those two things. And we had a study where we had 30 users using the system over 1 week again, where they logged in 3 times. It was the exact same study methodology as with the GeoPass system. And we found that it did have excellent memorability. It had 100% of people remembered it the day of, 1 day later, and 1 week later. So adding this additional information didn't impact memorability, and we hypothesized that it might have something to do with the fact that people can associate these two pieces of information very easily. And it's something, just as a side note, it compares favorably to text passwords. So we did a separate study on text passwords that had a similar structure, where we found that about 12% of people tend to forget their passwords over the span of 1 week, and that 23% of them will write that password down, whereas in this system, only 12% of people wrote a part of it down. Only one person wrote all of it down. So for security of GeoPassNotes, that's the name of the system that we called this adding a note to the location password, we found that 80% of passwords that were created in the system are estimated to be secure against an offline guessing attack. So we consider those to be secure, most of them, whereas if we compare it to text passwords, about less than 9% of the passwords that were found in the MySpace leak would be considered safe against our semantic guessing software. So we believe that we have an improvement here. So our results suggest, again, because it does have a longer login time than traditional passwords, it does suggest that it might be something useful for infrequently used accounts. But what we think is more interesting about this research is it tells us that people do find locations to be particularly memorable. And it might be an interesting area for further research to see, can we improve that login time while retaining memorability? So another project I'd like to mention is something that we call the presentation effect on graphical passwords. This was work done in collaboration with Moaz Al-Badawi, Brent McRae, both of UOIT, and Amir Ali Salahi Abari of University of Toronto. So the motivation behind this particular project was, we have this issue where people in many different types of password system, not just the traditional password system, they create predictable patterns, and those predictable patterns are what lead to attack. So when people choose things like password 123, attackers know that pattern, and they are more likely to guess that type of password. So that is a weakness. So the general security practice to combat this is to create security policies to prevent people from choosing this type of password. So it might be something like, your password must contain a special character. And in that case, you're trying to modify the password in a way, and the system is essentially limiting people and what they can create in order to produce better security behaviors. So we think that this is annoying. And so we asked the question, what if we could influence what people do rather than restrict them? Influence password creation and therefore, hopefully, password security. So we do this through a system that's called Graphical password. And we use a certain type of graphical password called passpoint style graphical passwords, where it's kind of shown here. The basic idea is that the person remembers parts of an image rather than a word. So they are shown this background image, or any background image, kind of like this. And then they choose a sequence of 5 points on that image. And that sequence of 5 points become their password. So instead of typing in a string, they click on a sequence of 5 points. So this is something that has been studied in the past, and we were interested to see if we could modify this particular interface to change users' behavior. So what we did, it was very simple. We just changed the interface in order to present that background image differently to different people at the time that they create their password. So to understand what we did, I'll explain the experiment that we performed. We ran a study with 34 participants over 1 week, and we divided them into 2 separate groups. With one group, we showed the image going from left to right at the time of password creation. And then the other group, we showed it right to left. And what we did was examine what kind of click points or locations on the image that they chose as their password as a result. And just as a side note, that revealing of the image was sped up for the purpose of the presentation. It was actually about 20 seconds to reveal the image in the experiment. So we ran some statistics, and we saw that the first click points that people chose had a different distribution depending on the group that they were in. So for the group that was shown the image right to left, we have shown their first points with a blue triangle. And you can see that they're mostly on the right side of the image. And then with the left to right group, you can see that their points, which are shown by red squares, that they're mostly on the left-hand side of the image. So we've influenced people's behavior when they go to choose their passwords, which is kind of exciting because we think that we can do that in a way that helps reduce the predictable patterns that we see. And we call the effect of this interface change the presentation effect. So what are the security implications of this? You might not immediately see. The security implication is that the attacker does not know how the user was shown that image at the time that they log in, right? That every user would be assigned a different presentation style, but the attacker wouldn't know what that is. They would just know the image that they need to log in with, and they would try to evaluate where are the most probable places that they could choose locations on that image without knowing the presentation. So what we think, our vision anyway, is that we could use that influence to nudge people to choose something different than that they would have otherwise in order to create something more secure. So let me show an example. If we had a system that was using this where we had 6 different users, maybe the system would present the background image to Alice from bottom to top, Bob from left to right, Carol from right to left, David from bottom to top, Elizabeth from the center out towards the edges, and Frank from the corners into the center. So everyone would see the image a little bit differently the first time that they saw it, and therefore hopefully choose different points. So that's what we're hoping will eventually happen from this work. And other ongoing research that we're doing is to see whether or not these kinds of presentation effects could be used to help nudge people to choose more strong text passwords. So when you go to create your text password, maybe you would see some kind of presentation or some kind of prime, and then that would influence you to choose a different password than what you would otherwise. Another piece of ongoing research that we're doing is looking at suggesting passwords to people that are more secure and hopefully just as memorable. So the concept is that the user would input a password, kind of like, for example, I love monkeys 5 in this example. And what the system would do is say, okay, that doesn't really look like a good password. It does have some of the common semantic patterns that we've observed. But I can tell you one that's based on 5 monkeys, but is actually secure. So I'm going to suggest to you 5 monkeys, $ can fly. And the idea here is that what is being suggested is semantically sensible. Like it actually makes sense because it's using our model that we've already trained using these 32 million passwords. And we have done some studies on this. It's actually a bit more complicated than what I've said, but that's the high-level view of it. The preliminary results do indicate that we haven't harmed memorability anyway. So we have done some studies on it already, and we are seeing some positive results. Some other ongoing research that we're doing is exploring location-based authentication for mobile devices. So seeing whether or not we can use that paradigm of people remembering a place and harnessing it to create better memorability on another system, but using it for mobile devices in a way that is a fast input method. We're also looking at it for fallback authentication. So instead of remembering your mother's maiden name, for example, you remember some part of a place or something that's associated to a place. Also, we're looking at strategies to help people create passphrases that they can remember. And we're looking at authentication using implicitly learned information. So what I mean by that is information that we've learned that we don't really know that we've learned it, and we can't really tell anyone that we've learned it, but we can actually authenticate with it. So that's another ongoing research project. So I've given you a lot of information today, and I'm aware that it was a lot of information, so I'm just going to leave you with a takeaway message that I think is probably the most important thing you can have learned from this lecture, and that's that there's 2 things you should do with your passwords, at least. One is find a secure password management strategy, because we have to remember so many passwords. What we always resort to is reusing them, and it's not the best thing, especially given the threats that are out there. So, given that, find something that you're comfortable with, that's some combination of using a password manager, writing your password down and storing them in a secure place, and trying to remember some set of them if you want to, if that's what you're more comfortable with. Then the second thing is to choose passwords. When you have to choose passwords that can't be guessed by anyone. So this is an easy way of thinking about, are they common patterns or not? Could a family member guess them? Could a friend guess them? Could an artificial intelligence guess them, based on what I've told you today? So that's the end. I'd like to take some questions now, and I encourage anybody who has questions that weren't answered at the end just to send me an email at this email address as well. Okay.